Welcome to the Forest Analytics Landing Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Russell. In this podcast, we'll talk about how data and analytics are transforming the forest products industry. We'll share how a research-based approach to analytics can empower your forestry organization to make better decisions with your data. Welcome, everyone, to today's podcast. Today, I want to talk about Paycheck Protection Program loans. And specifically loans to the forest products industry that have been made here throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, this is mostly about a post I recently wrote. Well, I actually wrote one right after the Paycheck Protection Program loan program ended back in May of 2021. But some new data has come through. Some of the data were recently updated. I'll mention that these data are provided by the Small Business Administration, U.S. government providing companies loans for really to keep their workers working throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. So it was a post I wrote almost a year ago, but then recently updated. And I'll definitely link to the article because it has a lot of neat graphics and tables with a lot of information for individual U.S. states and for individual programs within the forest products industry. And so generally, the Paycheck Protection Program administered by the Small Business Administration in the U.S., it came about, really started in April of 2020 and ended in 2021. And it was really in response to all the business challenges presented by the COVID-19 pandemic. And so companies and industries trying to keep their workers employed throughout many of the hardships that many companies faced throughout the pandemic. Now, it was mainly a program to ensure that businesses keep their workers on payroll. And so the good thing about the program was that most of the loans are forgivable. And so recent data, at least as of the last couple of weeks, showed that about 87% of all of the total value in PPP loans distributed have been forgiven. And so just an incredible amount of funds that could help keep programs and companies running and operating. Now, just to give some perspective, in the U.S., the Small Business Administration gave out 12 million loans, totaling about $800 billion. And so that'll kind of put some perspectives in before I dive into talking about what it meant for the forest products industry. And so if we look at the different sectors of the economy that received these loans, where forestry sits, so forestry is often lumped into agriculture, fishing, and hunting in those industries. And so forestry received about 4% of all of the value of all of the PPP loans. And so that would have included forestry along with ag, fishing, and hunting. And so that total of all of those industries was over 500,000 loans. Now, some of the sectors that received the most loans and the most amount, obviously a lot of the hospitality industries, accommodation and food services, construction, and obviously healthcare and social assistance. So those are the big industries that really received the bulk of the loans. But forestry, ag, fishing, and hunting took about 4% of the loans. So in looking at the data specific to forest products companies, we can look within that sector and look at some of the North American industry classification system codes for specific forest industries. And so these can include things like forest nurseries, logging, paper product manufacturers, pulp and paper mills, other wood product manufacturing companies. And so in total, there's about 28 different industries representing the forest products industry that we can take a look at with the PPP loan data. When we look and we kind of filter out all of the Small Business Administration's database to just look at forest products companies, they receive over 35,000 loans during the pandemic for a total of about $4.7 billion through the PPP program. And so they offered these loans in 3 different rounds. And so the first round was really in early 2020, really right when the pandemic began. and some of the funds were really quickly exhausted in April of 2020. Soon after that, they opened up a second round beginning in May of 2020, and that basically lasted all of the summer of 2020. And then finally, a third round came about in early 2021, lasting up until about June of 2021. And actually, the program ran out of funds in May of 2021, and so there weren't many loans given after that. And so if we look at the distribution of the different sectors within forestry that received loans, logging companies received the most loans. And so over 12,000 loans to logging companies. And then companies that are registered as other wood product manufacturers received the second amount, pretty close to logging. And so it's interesting to look at where the distribution of PPP loans went to different sectors. And so if we look at the different kinds of sectors and the average loan amounts, we can look and see that converted paper product manufacturers and pulp and paper mills received the largest loan amounts, often exceeding $300,000 on average. And so a lot of the other industries, including veneer plywood and engineered wood product manufacturers, also reported the greatest number of jobs that were supported through the PPP loan program. And so as an example, pulp and paper mills, on average, each loan supported 26 jobs in the program. And so if we look at the post that I have does a great job of showing this, but if you look at the number of jobs reported for the company that received the loan versus their amount, there's obviously a positive relationship. And so the more jobs that are supported through a PPP loan, the more that loan is going to be. But if we look at the forest industry data, by far the majority of PPP loans were provided to forest products companies at an amount less than $50,000. And so that's obviously a pretty small loan amount relative to some of the other larger values from larger companies. And so in total, 61% of all PPP loans were provided to companies that were less than $50,000. There were some that obviously had a lot more. And so even some loan sizes of greater than $5 million. And that represented about 161 loans out of the 35,000 loans that were offered to the forest products industry. And so also important to understand kind of how they support jobs. And so PPP loans provided to logging companies supported the greatest number of jobs, over 65,000 jobs for that sector in logging. Some of the loan amounts to specific logging companies supported the smallest number of jobs on average. However, over 12,000 loans were provided to that industry. And so in the logging industry, a lot of loans, typically smaller in value, as we think about logging companies that are not necessarily big manufacturers employing tons of people, but lots of them, typically smaller loan amounts. It's also interesting to see kind of distributed across the United States where most of the PPP loan money went. And so when we look at the data, California received the greatest number of loans, over 2,000 of them, and the largest amount, over $358 million, compared to all of the states in the U.S. A couple of the other big states that received a lot of funding in PPP loans were Oregon, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Texas, New York, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So all of those are really heavily forested states with a strong forest products industry. So it would make sense then that they might receive a good majority of the PPP loans. Some of the smallest average loan values across the states include the U.S. Virgin Islands, Hawaii, Vermont, Puerto Rico, and Wyoming. Each of those less than $60,000 on average to forest products companies within those states. And so interesting to look at the distribution of PPP loans, depending on the state. And so the data are really interesting, in that the data can show you basically every company that's applied for a PPP loan, approved for it, and kind of the dates of their application, how many jobs they support, the loan amount, and things like that. And so it's a really interesting data to look and see kind of how this loan program helped the forest products industry make it through the COVID-19 pandemic. And so obviously with lumber prices the way that they were in much of 2020, 2021, it seems like going into more uncertainty areas now as we're going into 2022. These PPP loans no doubt have helped to support the people that work in those forest products industries. Again, over 35,000 loans offered to forest products companies throughout the pandemic. And I think it really shows that the use of these funds helped many of these companies get through the pandemic. And so obviously, when it comes to forest products companies, there are small companies like logging companies that received a lot of the loans, typically at smaller amounts, but then also large companies, large pulp and paper mills, employing hundreds of people that also received PPP loans. And so I encourage you to take a look at the graph or the post and all the graphs and tables that kind of go along with it. If you're interested in your own state, there's some data there in your own state. I think it's really insightful. I think it's really important to understand how this program by the Small Business Administration has helped to support the forest products industry throughout the pandemic. So thanks for listening, everyone. Thanks for listening to the Forest Analytics Landing Podcast. For more information on how data and analytics can empower your organization, visit arbor-analytics.com.